So my name is Meredith Lee, and I am Climate Programs Manager for Member Engagement at Second Nature. I'm really excited to have Deborah and Donna here from Calyx Global for today's webinar, Top Research Needs for Improving Integrity in the Voluntary Carbon Market. A couple of logistics before we get started. We are recording, so we will make this event available afterwards for folks who couldn't attend in real time. If you have questions throughout the event, please put them in the chat and I will work on stacking them for Deborah and Donna after the presentation happens. And then just make sure that you should be automatically muted, but in case something happens or I don't have this set up right, which is quite likely, just make sure that your audio is muted so that we can give Deborah and Donna the full spotlight. So a quick intro into how this webinar came about. Previous to my role in member engagement for Second Nature, I served as the Carbon Offsets Fellow. And so Second Nature has been doing a lot of work over the last couple of years to provide offsets resources to higher education institutions and to really collaborate with higher education institutions on offset integrity. So we offer some programs and initiatives around offsets, two programs, C2P2 and the Offsets Lab. These are focused on helping higher ed institutions develop offset projects and also to engage their students and faculty in teaching and research. We also facilitate a monthly carbon offsets advisory council. And we are releasing in January version 3 of our carbon markets and offset guidance, which is a pretty comprehensive overview of carbon offsets, voluntary compliance markets, recommendations for higher education's engagement in carbon offset markets, and risk assessment for a lot of different carbon offset project types. And one of the things that we're really excited about that is very new is we've partnered with Calyx Global to offer members of Second Nature access to Calyx Global's carbon ratings platform. And so that we really feel is taking our guidance further by allowing our members to see project level ratings for carbon offsets. And Calyx not only does greenhouse gas integrity ratings, but also adherence to SDG. And so anyways, we're just very excited about that. And you can reach out to me. I will put my email in the chat if you're interested in any of these resources and interested in our partnership with Calyx. So enough about Second Nature. I want to introduce our speakers today and turn the situation over to them. So I'm really excited to have Donna Lee, CEO and founder of Calyx Global, who has worked on climate change for 2 decades. She's a co-founder of Calyx Global, and she is also on the ICBCM's expert panel and on the SBTI's technical advisory group. She was formerly at the State Department, where, among other duties, she served as a climate change negotiator for the United States. And after that, served as an advisor to governments, philanthropies, and companies seeking to take climate action. Her goals in life align with Calyx's mission to contribute to the well-being of people and to protect the planet. We also have Deborah Lawrence, who's chief scientist at Calyx Global, and her job is to ensure the scientific integrity of Calyx Global's greenhouse gas ratings. She's the director of research and analytics for nature-based solutions. She spent 25 years as an environmental sciences professor at the University of Virginia, where she conducted global forest and climate research. During that period, she was a science advisor to the US Department of State, Office of Global Change. She later helped establish Silvacarbon, a US federal interagency program for forest carbon measurement and monitoring, serving on the steering committee and as chair of the technical team. She also served on the technical committee on agriculture, forestry, and other land use at the American Carbon Registry. So lots of expertise here in the room today, and I will turn it over to, I believe, Donna first to kick us off for our webinar today. Thanks, ladies.
Yeah, no, thanks so much, Meredith, and thanks for organizing this. And thank you to all the universities that are tuning in today, or maybe even after today and are watching this recording, because I feel 2 things, maybe especially after this recent election, that voluntary action is going to be as important as ever. Like every bit counts. And I wrote a blog recently, and I wanted people to feel there is no contribution too small, because we are in a space now where climate policy is going to be difficult. And I think that means that voluntary actions by companies, by universities, by individuals are ever more important. So thank you for tuning in. And thank you for taking an interest in how universities can contribute to improving the impact of the voluntary carbon market. So that's why we're here today. Deborah and I just want to share a little bit about, from our experience of working in this rabbit hole, right? I spend 24/7, but a lot of time looking and thinking about the voluntary carbon market. How is it that universities can engage to really help to improve the impact? So first of all, I just thought it'd be useful to step back. Like, is there a problem that we're trying to solve? And I think it's fair to say, if you go to the next slide, that indeed it is no secret that there is right now a quality problem in the voluntary carbon market. And in fact, what I've seen is that this quality problem that has been written about by Bloomberg Green, by The Guardian, you even see John Oliver, the Washington Post, writing about this, what it has resulted in to some extent, is companies, individuals, organizations actually taking less action. And I think that's really unfortunate that these types of risks that we see result in less climate mitigation. So yes, there is a quality problem. If you go to the next slide, it's some of our findings. So at Calyx Global, we have looked at now over 650 carbon projects. We are a carbon credit ratings agency, so we go deeply into looking at the quality of various carbon credit claims. And as you can see here, this picture is our ratings for those 650 or so projects from A+ to E. A couple of things to notice here. One is there's not too many A-rated projects. Like, there is a challenge, and quite a few at sort of the back end. So this is a market that really needs some reform, right? It needs to be improved. One thing that's notable is that you can see it doesn't matter the specific sector. Like, every sector has a high variability of quality, from forest and land related projects to household and community, renewable energy, waste, etc. Every sector, there's quite a high variability in the greenhouse gas integrity that we're seeing of these credits. It's even more striking if you go to the next slide, if you look at the volume of issuances. So that last slide was number of projects. This is by issuance volume, so the actual number of credits that are being generated. There you'll see it's even harder to find high quality. So our mission at Calyx Global is better carbon markets. Like, we're really trying to push the markets to higher quality. So this can be an instrument that can be used with confidence. Okay, so we know there's a problem. The next question I wanted to ask, if you go to the next slide, is why? Like, why is it that we're seeing this quality problem? And then also what can be done about it? And that's where we're going to get into the role that we believe academia and universities can play. So if you go to the next slide, I just want to step back a little bit and think about why is it we ended up in this place where we have such problems in the voluntary carbon market. And it's worth remembering that this is not a compliance market. A compliance market, by definition, there is a regulator, and that regulator is accountable, right? Because usually it is a governmental body that has constituencies, that has authority. So the voluntary market is very different. It's this sort of like ecosystem of actors that's very organic, and truly anyone, any organization could decide, I'm going to issue carbon credits, right? And there's no oversight over that. And historically, this market, I show here the supply chain of the market. So you have investors, they invest in project developers use standard bodies, and then those standard bodies issue credits, and those credits often are resold and created markets created through brokers and traders. There's no oversight historically over these actors. These actors were all what I would call market makers. So all of them were incentivized to make the market, right? Most of them were incentivized by creating volumes of credits. So if you think about project developers, they're trying to, it's not wrong. They're just trying to optimize or increase the volumes. The same with the standard bodies who are paid based on credit issuance fees or brokers and traders. So these were all market makers that were historically part of what we call kind of the voluntary carbon market 1.0. What has changed and what's interesting is starting in sort of the last year or two, we've seen this pivot. We've seen changes in the market that have started to put pressure and provide different types of checks and balances and oversight. So we have the media plays a really important role with their ability to do things like investigative reporting. I would say a lot of that investigative reporting is also based on academic literature and studies that have come out talking about the quality of credits. So that type of transparency and accountability can be very important. We have new regulatory bodies like the Commodity Futures Trading, the CFTC, that's providing some oversight. California Assembly Bill 1305 requiring companies to be transparent about the credits that they're using. The Security and Exchange Commission is starting to provide some sort of quasi-regulation around transparency. This can be really powerful. In addition, there's new players, and I would consider ratings agencies to be one of those, where we're trying to provide some accountability for the quality in those markets. The reason why I'm raising this and talking about the system of the voluntary carbon market, I do think there's a space for academia to really look at this system, this voluntary carbon market, this organic ecosystem of actors, and help think through what is it that this system needs to create those checks and balances, to create a stronger, more sustainable market that organizations can have confidence in. So we talk about this being part of the maturity of the market, and the market right now is not mature. It's quite immature, in fact. And I think there's a role there for someone to do a study to think, what is it? Like, what are the right set of actors? How should the system work? What type of transparency do we need? There's like insurance, that's new. Like, to what role should different actors play? So there's sort of a systems thinking here that I really haven't seen that much studies or really deep thought around what should that system look like and what system should we build. Okay, that's sort of the big picture. I did want to show this one last picture before handing it over to Deborah, who will talk about some of the more technical ways academia can be involved. This systems change that we're starting to see, we're really on the cusp of this change, is really demonstrated by the quality of credit issuances that we've seen this year. So this graph shows the percent of issuances with certain ratings. And what you can see is in 2024, it's the first year where we see a significant decline in poorly rated credits. And I think a lot of that is related to these new players in this space. So definitely media has played a role. I believe the ICVCM and ratings agencies are also playing a role. And what we really need is to see more of this pivot to sort of overcome that crisis of confidence and give companies and organizations more confidence in engaging. So I'm going to stop there and hand it over to Deborah, who's going to talk a little bit more about some of the technical ways that folks can get involved.
Great. That was a great overview. So the first place that we can think about academia engaging is in how the projects actually function. So the cookbooks, the way that the methodologies are written for how we get emission reductions. Most of these have been written by project developers. So, they write them trying to do their best to figure out how to calculate the emission reductions they're achieving or the removals they're achieving. But they also may be tweaking the edges to be sure that their project fits and comes out looking good. There's often a public comment period for new methodologies. So there is some ability for people to jump in. There often are not very many submissions. In fact, the most recent one we looked at had zero comments. So really, there's lots of room for input, including for any of the people on this call. You can read a methodology, you can try to understand it, you can ask questions about it. There's more deep involvement as well. So the way that we think about integrity at Calyx Global is that it's really a four-legged stool. We think about additionality, whether or not the project would happen anyway. We think about permanence or durability. Is that credit going to be worth something? Is the CO2 going to be saved out of the atmosphere for a long time? We think about overcrediting. Did they actually get the math right? And then we think about overlapping claims. So those are the four feet on this stool. And the fact is that there's plenty of research to do on any one of those legs of the stool. So I would say one easy way to think about getting engaged is if your university or your lab or your group or some group has an interest in a certain type of project, just take it on. Take on some project type, identify the key issues, and dig in, study it. Now you might think, well, how would you identify the key issues? There are places out there who can help you. The ICVCM has opinions. There's a group called the CCQI. There's groups that are NGOs that are sector-based. There are people making reports. There's the US government. There's Calyx Global. Follow us. Like, we all have opinions about what's going on in these project types. We can help identify some of the key pressure points. And then you can take that and really go with it. So you can think of it as you've got some project type you're interested in, or your university is, just investigate. Specific examples, I just want to give you a flavor for what kinds of things you might find. One of the biggest issues that we find are that we have issues around how the emission reduction or the removal claim is made. We can always use better data to evaluate those claims. So just some quick examples here. In the technologies space, there are some new project types like enhanced weathering, biochar, different kinds of concrete, direct air capture. For some of these, we need lots more information on how dissolution dynamics occur in a soil or in water. We need to understand decomposition of biochar over time and in space, and what are the constraints. These are like physics problems. They're maybe ecological problems. They're problems anyone can think about. For the people who are not, say, ecologists or physicists, maybe they're life cycle analysts out there, we have to understand how life cycle analysis can work for the carbon market. It's not always the same kinds of trade-offs we would make. For forest and land or the nature space, we could always use more information on how trees grow, how forests grow, how they change year on year. We really could use more models of growth, more observations from space. Biomass is always a challenge and super important for all of these nature-based project types. There's a lot to do for people who think about uncertainty. These would be the statisticians in the room, or maybe people who think about complex systems. Understanding uncertainty in our predictions, especially for project types like reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation. We really need to understand how to think about that uncertainty, how to quantify it, and how to incorporate it best into our assessments of the emission reductions. And then finally, soil carbon is a bit of a black box still. This happened to be something that I studied as an academic. We could use more work on soil carbon, on getting those models to work better, and on figuring out how to do assessments that maybe don't require thousands and thousands of samples. So lots of ways to plug in for figuring out emission reductions. But that's not the only kind of work that's needed. So overcrediting, that was for our thoughts about, are they getting the math right? Do they get the emissions reductions correct? The other big constraint for the integrity of these projects is often what we call additionality. So that is asking the question of this crystal ball, would it have happened without the carbon project? This is a fundamental question, and it's not something you just apply some kind of algorithm to. It really takes a lot of thought. So figuring out additionality is just as important as figuring out the math. And when we think about additionality, what are we talking about? Well, we often try to understand several key questions when we think about additionality. Is this activity common? Is it something that you've seen a lot of? Because maybe it would just be happening anyway. Does it make its own money? Like, can it make it by itself without carbon revenues? And then finally, could it be happening for some other reason, like regulation or policy or incentives or subsidies? So these are the kinds of questions we ask. And we need even more questions. Like, we need your help thinking through all the different ways we can try to understand, would this project have happened anyway? Those constraints alone lead us to all sorts of questions about trying to understand markets and trends, trying to do financial analysis at the project level. What are the constraints of this type of project? Thinking about, especially for the land-based projects, what are the population dynamics? What are the demographics? What are they poor people? Are they rich people? What do those types of people demand from the land? All trying to understand, would this project happen even if there were no carbon finance? Finally, we need to really understand policy and regulations all over the world. So you might be the person out there who knows exactly what's going on in Namibia, and that might help us. So understanding these frameworks of markets and trends, financials, demographic and social change, policies and regulations, we need to understand them in specific countries, in regions, and across the world. So some of you know about these places, and we would love to know about it too. So integrity is this four-legged stool. I just talked to you about additionality and permanence, and overcrediting or doing the math, but we also have permanence issues. We would love to see giant global gridded data sets on risk associated with climate change, right? Think about all the risks. There are so many. There are risks to humans that affect project success. There are risks to nature that affect project success. So there's a lot of potential work to do on permanence. And then on overlapping claims, this is one of those questions like what Donna was talking about with the ecosystem. How do we be sure that the same carbon ton is not being counted in multiple places? Like, what kind of problem is that? And what are the solutions to it? So that's like a deep dive on some of the most important constraints we have. One thing I want to remind you of is that you really have a special role to play, because you can think about it in a new way. Like, we're part of this ecosystem. We have some opinions, but we are really always in need of new ideas. So what is your role? I feel like I'm really well placed to tell you, because I am you. Like, I was you until May of this year. So I spent many years, I won't go through my bio, but I did spend many years at UVA, my whole career until this point, as an academic. And it was so rewarding. I know you all know what is wonderful about being in academia. I wonder if you also shared my sense that it was sometimes hard to feel like I was doing something that was making an impact outside of academia. And so in my own career, I took opportunities to pursue activities that took me outside of academia. It's how I met Donna when I was at the State Department. I did that on a sabbatical. And then this other work that I did following that year in the State Department was work that I did while I was full-time at UVA. It meant it was a little hard. I will tell you, it was a bit hard. I felt like I had two jobs for much of my career, but it was so rewarding. And if you're like me, we had a deal at the University of Virginia where we were allowed to do consulting. And I took that opportunity to learn and to contribute. So that's a quick fast forward on one way. Remember that you are a person and you have a life, and you can actually spend some time doing some of these things. So why did I actually leave? I had a great thing going. I loved my job and I loved doing all this work on the side, but I really did feel that it was time for me to do something that would directly address the climate crisis. I loved sending my young climate warriors out into the world. And then I realized I wanted to be one. And so it was time for me to make the move. And I was so pleased to find my way to Calyx Global. So I left, you don't have to leave. I want you to remember a few things about what if you just stay and do your best to contribute. So I would say be problem driven. What is holding back integrity for something that you care about, some project type? You have to remember that you actually might know, I mean, you might not know what is the problem, but somebody else does, and you can ask. You can ask us, like, what are the problems? What is holding us back? My example about additionality really highlights to me that interdisciplinary approaches are key. It's not just a bunch of math, physics, or ecology, and it's not even just economics. We really have to think broadly. So think interdisciplinarily. The more you can scale up, the more applicable your work will be. I used to study phosphorus in like square meters, okay? So, but it was helpful for me to think about what those phosphorus dynamics meant at the scale of the globe. The more you can scale up your work, the more useful it is for the carbon market, because we need information from all over. Peer-reviewed global gridded data sets are super valuable. I know that that's not going to make you famous. Like, I know, I am you. Those data sets do not make you famous, but we need them. And we have to start valuing this kind of contribution, which is a data set that can be used to assess integrity for projects all over the world. It has to be global. The other thing that doesn't get you famous is compiling and assessing and evaluating existing work. I know it also is not going to make you famous, but meta-analysis, studies that pull things together, we need those broad views. We need to know everything you can tell us about China or South Africa or the coal industry or mine methane, like you name it, we need to know it, and we need to know it globally. So this is not the kind of thing that's going to make you famous, but it's going to actually make you really a serious contributor. So think about it, be problem-driven, interdisciplinary, scale up, do global analysis, and look at what already is out there and help us understand it. So last bit, sorry, I'm going on. Don't forget that academia is not just about research. I know, being you, that it's actually kind of the most important thing we do. It's how we get evaluated, but you have teaching and service. Train the future voluntary carbon market. There are so many actors out there, from the finance side to the validator side, the auditor side, the project developers, the economists. We need everybody to be thinking about the voluntary market. And then think about your next sabbatical. Think about any professional development opportunities you have. You could actually take that chance to learn something about the market and to contribute. So last thing to say is do this, be with us, talk to us, be a part of the conversation that is outside of academia. I would urge you to be humble, because we think we know everything. I did, and I know lots of my colleagues do. We don't, and so be humble and be listening, and that's the way you can make your best contribution, but also be ready. It can be a little bit scary. There's a lot of money at stake, and if you stick your neck out, just be ready that, it's hard. It can be hard, but we appreciate your voice and we need your voice. So I'll just finally say thank you so much for being here, because it means you want to help move the market and you want to help this be a tool that helps us address the climate crisis. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Deborah. And maybe before we go back to Meredith, I don't know if you can
I
maybe
can go
start
back.
presenting so that
Oh,
we
sure.
can see each other. Yeah, there we go. Hi, Meredith. I just wanted to say two things. One is the value of independent academic information is really important in this market, because this market is full of financially interested players who come up with their own data sets that benefit their project. And so it's super valuable to have academia who doesn't have that conflict, providing this type of information to the market. That's super valuable. And the second thing is, if you have students who are interested in doing one of these projects, as Deborah said, to like dig in, they're not sure where to start, have them contact us, because we have tons of ideas of where, and we have also worked with interns from a range of universities, to partner with them to help find some of the right problems, the problems that they can help solve that can have a real impact on this market. And I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Meredith.
That's amazing. Thank you both. And honestly, so inspiring. I get so excited about connecting research with real world problems, but we know it's not simple, right? But I get really excited about these conversations that just kind of open up, yeah, the dialogue and help us explore what the opportunities are, because as you say, it is very much needed. So there are a couple questions in the chat. Two questions from Franziska. I hope you're pronouncing your name right. I apologize if I am not. Who says, first, the data shows that better quality ratings are issued. Do you know if this also translates to better quality ratings being retired, i.e. purchased by companies?
That's a really great question. So we only showed issuances. We did not show the quality of retirements. I will say, I looked at the retirements a couple months ago, and the retirements did not show the same really significant change that we see in the issuances. And I was thinking about why is that the case? I really sort of want to update that graph. So stay tuned. We will provide that updated graph on the Calyx Global website at some point in time. But in some ways, if you think about it, issuances are a leading indicator and retirements are a lagging indicator. So I think what issuances are showing is that project developers, who are the ones, or the resellers or the intermediaries in the market, are the ones that are issuing the units. They issue it because they think there's a buyer or they expect there will be a buyer. So in some ways, the fact that the issuances, the quality is improving, means that those project developers and resellers and intermediaries don't believe that the market for those poor qualities is as strong as it has been in the past. Now, the reason why retirements might not show that change right away is because it takes a while to work its way into the market. A lot of times, buyers have forward contracts, so they have to wind those forward contracts down before they can move to sort of a different type of credit that meets their needs. So it's not too surprising to me that we would see this change happening in the issuances first before we see them in the retirements, for those reasons. And the fact that the supply in the market, which is the issuances, the difference between the issuances and the retirements is that sort of supply in the market. That means that supply in the market is improving. And so hopefully we will see it in the retirement data soon. I would expect so.
That's a great answer. Thanks. The second question is, do you know if how many and what kind of companies use Calyx ratings to make more informed choices about purchasing carbon offsets?
Yeah, in some ways, that's what we try to do. Like that's our our mission is to drive this climate finance to places of higher impact. But the channel and the mechanism through which we do that is exactly to work with companies to try to help them make more informed and better choices, to try to drive those companies to purchase credits based on our assessment, right, of their impact. So it's exactly what we do, I suppose, on a day-to-day basis, is work with a number of companies. And I have seen over the 2 to 3 years that we've been providing this data to companies, I definitely have seen them change. I think the biggest change that I've seen is companies 2 or 3 years ago buying based on almost charisma, like buying based on what they thought, you know, would make a really beautiful photo in their sustainability brochure, um, and assuming that quality was there. But I think as companies have become more educated and realize that there's this high variability in quality, we definitely, at least those that we work with, we see them moving definitely towards higher quality.
Great. Thank you. I want to turn some questions on, I guess, to everyone, anyone who's willing to speak about some of the barriers around connecting research with this space. I think what we've seen is, it has something to do with like the culture of research, but it also has a lot to do with funding. And I'm wondering if maybe Donna and Deborah, you have other insights on like what are the major barriers to kind of getting more research that's responsive to these real world problems of the carbon markets? Is it like a lack of knowledge of what's needed, or partnerships, or funding, or what do you think?
Well, I want to make a plug first for this is why you can do that, those like number 4 and 5, global data sets and assessing what's out there. Like that is something you can do with students that is a perfect student project where students might not really feel like maybe it's either a giant class project or a couple of semesters worth of a class or something where you have a lot of hours baked in and you can get people to work on digging up data. So there's some of that work can happen without a lot of funding. There's no doubt that funding is always limited, though. Like we are mostly limited by our own ability to spend time on things. And the way we spend more time is to get people with us, and we have to pay them to help us. So certainly we need more funding. I think that, as I recall from the grant cycles, there's at least from the United States, there's a lot of interest in real world problems, and being able to tie your very applied or your very unapplied work to a real world problem can often increase its chances of success. So perhaps the job for us is to connect with you and to help you understand how the weird thing that you study actually could help the carbon market. And maybe it would actually improve the chances of getting grant funding. So, this is always a problem. But I would also say that internal sources at universities, internal university funding often loves a real world problem. So that's, especially if it's somehow connected to the university's own operations. So think about plugging into internal funding sources as well as those giant grant agencies that are national.
Maybe I'll just throw a couple things out because I do see it on the Q&A. One of the questions was, what sources of funding would you recommend we explore? And I will say that there is philanthropic funding for this type of research, if you can tie it to how that creates scale in mitigation. So if you look at, for example, who is funding the Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets, right? It's Bezos Earth Fund, it's Google, it's High Tide Foundation. You can look at those organizations that are funding this type of work. I think a number of governments also are starting to fund this type of work. So for example, on land use, the Growing Climate Solutions Act gave a fair amount of funding to US Department of Agriculture to actually develop and think about carbon methodologies, right? So there are these sources of funding that are out there. They have to be tied to some objective, right? That's going to help to scale. And if you can tell that story, having worked, in fact, for philanthropy in the past, right? Tell a story of how this work that you're going to do actually will reach its way into helping to scale a mitigation activity. I think there's a fair number of philanthropies that could be quite interested in funding that type of work.
That's great. And this one might be for Deborah, but if you had to prioritize the areas of research you raised, what would be the biggest bottleneck in scaling the voluntary credit market?
Well, so here's like, so I'd have to go with nature because nature is scalable right now. Like a lot of the interesting new types of project types we have are technology based, and they're smaller. So if we're talking about immediate ability to scale, we need the ability to do year on year accounting for biomass change in forests, because there are many forest-based projects that they could be good. They have a lot of promise. They have tons of volume, so they really could deliver a lot of mitigation. And yet there are issues about like, well, do we think they really got the removals that they claimed? Like, that's a big question. And the more independent data sets we could bring to bear to say, we're pretty sure that they got those removals. Like they claimed this much and we see this much. But remember, we need to say that all around the world. We need a global data set that is annually recurring. So I think that would be my top pick. Donna, do you have a top pick that's maybe not nature, since nature is kind of my thing?
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of ways, mitigation activities. Like we looked at the reducing emissions from nitrous oxide, some of the super pollutants, I think, that are really important to reduce today. How can we provide confidence in the measurement of those reductions? In some ways, I feel like when academia comes out and provides that sort of underpinning and that foundation of that scientific research to say, yes, like this is both additional, it's uncommon, it's not going to happen anyways, it's measurable. And if you do X, Y, and Z, like we can have confidence in that. Like when you have an independent third party, especially one coming from academia, saying, yes, like we can have confidence in this, that can really help to underpin and give confidence in the market. So I don't have a particular mitigation activity because there's so many, there's so many that we can tackle. But just to have sort of this independent source saying that, providing that foundation can just be really helpful.
All right, I want to have time to get to SDGs a little bit, but I don't want to ignore Rick's questions in the Q&A. Just seem to be kind of balancing with like, aren't the methodologies good enough? Shouldn't we be being conservative anyway? Of course, there's always better data possible, or we can't know a counterfactual sort of a what am I missing kind of vibe in Rick's questions. And maybe I feel like you touched on that a little bit when you talked about what the folks who are kind of funding this thing and standing it up have to gain, but maybe you could go a little bit deeper on some of that for us.
Yeah, I'll give a perspective on this because a lot of people ask us, like, why do you need to even be rating if ostensibly the emission reduction or removal is verified, right? It is audited by what's called the validation verification body. So the problem is those independent verification processes that you're mentioning can only verify against the methodology, against the cookbook, right? So if the cookbook says do X and the project does X, the verification body can't go back and say, well, actually the cookbook isn't correct. Like in some ways, the cookbook is allowing too much flexibility in how you made this calculation so that I actually think you're overcrediting. They can't say that. So the verification body can only verify against, did you follow exactly the directions? And the problem that we're seeing is that those fundamental directions, the cookbooks, some often actually have little loopholes or have areas where a project developer can kind of maximize or optimize the claimed volume of credit. So fundamentally, and this is a great place for academia, is to work on carbon methodologies, to create better cookbooks, right? Or as Deborah said, those cookbooks go through a public consultation period with oftentimes nobody actually commenting on them, nobody jumping in. I think this is a great place for philanthropy to fund academics to actually go, because the problem is pro bono, who wants to read 300 pages of a carbon methodology? But what we need is to have somebody fund academia to come in and really provide a thorough review of those cookbooks or those methodologies. And that's just not happening right now.
I'm interested, Donna, to that point. Like, is there any effort to do ratings of methodologies instead of or in addition to projects? Because there's a huge range of, um, within adherence to a methodology, there can be projects that are doing really great, right? And then a project adhering to the same methodology that's maybe overestimating. So yeah, talk about that.
Well, I think Deborah does it.
Okay.
Deborah,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, we do this all the time.
We rate methodologies. Yeah, go ahead, Deborah.
We assess them,
Yeah.
and we can highlight where we think there are issues, and that's where your help in the public comment period would be good, all of you, because you probably would find some of the issues that we find. But we've also found that we look at a methodology and we think, well, this is great. This is going to be great. And then we open up the projects and we're like, did they see this coming? We're shocked that there's something there. And then we think, wait a minute, how did they not see this coming? Or I know I'm speaking vaguely, but things that come up and you just can't anticipate necessarily when you're writing a methodology the way it will end up in the field. So we feel like project level assessment is critical, and you can't actually judge a book by its cover. You just can't. You have to actually read the book, because a methodology is just as good as the situation it encounters and the people who are implementing it. And it's just sometimes you can't always anticipate how things will be interpreted and how it may be completely legal, legit, following the cookbook, and yet make no sense. So we do rate them. We don't rate them. We look at them hard before we get deep into the project level assessments. But we also think that you got to do a project level assessment.
Got it. Okay, and then maybe quickly for Rick, maybe we could give an example of a complication that could come up with an additionality in that kind of tussle between the cookbook and the project. So it's not, what's a complication that could come up there with, since you can never know a counterfactual, right? Like, what's an example of that being maybe not so simple that turns into a problematic project rating?
Donna, you pick
Well,
one.
I mean, I see that he's suggesting issues around maybe convert. So let's say it's about forced conversion. Like, is this forest really going under pressure to be deforested, right? I think that's really hard to know. So you might write the best methodology you can, but you can never envision every single circumstance of what can happen. So I live in Colorado, and I will say there are patches of forests where I just know, because they provide maybe recreational opportunities, even though they could be converted, that the local community would not allow it to be converted, right? There's so many sort of very peculiar specifics that you can't tell from looking at a GIS map or a property map or land use map of whether or not something is going to be converted or not converted. And it's almost impossible to write like the comprehensive questions or in cookbook to think of every single possibility that could happen on a very dynamic landscape. So that's one example where it can be really tough, like some forests in some countries have spiritual significance, and you just might not know that, right? You might not have thought of that when you thought about the writing the methodology.
Great example. So I want to ask you about sustainable development goals or adherence to sustainable development goals for projects. I know that this is on the newer side for project reporting and verification, or it's getting more refined, right? Projects claimed adherence to sustainable development goals. And for some projects, it's quite obvious how they may be impacting sustainable development goal outcomes positively or negatively. But for some projects, it's a little bit harder to say, like, for example, an energy efficiency project in the United States, like they're seeing requirements from the registry to say how they're adhering to at least 3 sustainable development goals. And so I'm wondering if you think it would be an interesting thing for academia to work on different methodologies for people to understand how they're impacting sustainable development goals. Kind of more, we don't have a lot of metrics, I don't think, for what it looks like to fulfill sustainable development goals. So is that a spot where academia could be of service?
Yeah, I'll say absolutely yes. Like that's an area that is even more nascent than greenhouse gas accounting. So greenhouse gas accounting has had several decades of folks working on these methodologies. That doesn't really exist now for sustainable development goals. And the ability to, for example, even create a baseline of what would have happened without the project. That doesn't exist right now. So projects make claims about the contributions that they're making to a range of sustainable development goals, you know, improving poverty, gender empowerment, like all these different goals. But there's really no methodology behind it, no clarity on that claim. And what is it that the project exactly did to change, right, the trajectory of what was going to happen anyway? So that's an area, Meredith, you put your finger on an area that needs a lot of work. Um, and we certainly, when we're rating sustainable development goal contributions, we look at exactly this, like how strong did the project demonstrate that they were behind the change, right? Like what type of evidence did they provide? Did they even have a methodology of how to make those claims? Because those methodologies don't exist, we look at whether or not they even created one, right, in order to make the claim. So I think it's an area that definitely needs work. Thanks for pointing that out.
Yeah, it's something I've been curious about. We do help colleges and universities with a few energy efficiency projects, and that's something that really stood out to me in doing that work. Um, so yeah, that's exciting. So I think you
Yeah.
said that you work with some researchers now, and could you maybe describe just briefly, because we're almost out of time, like how does that relationship work? Is it like a researcher would reach out to Calyx and be like, oh, I just have all this free time and I want to work on this, or do you hire them, or is it a little bit of both? And how can folks engage with you? Yeah, if they want to keep thinking about this.
Well, I can speak to many of our interactions are with students. So more so than with professors. There's often internships available through schools. I know that in my own at UVA, there was a bunch of environmentally oriented internship funding sources where, you know, we could put our name in the hat and say, if someone wants to work with us on this problem, UVA will pay. So sometimes we get our students funded that way. We do only take funded students at this point, unless it's part of a class, which is also a possibility. We want to be sure that these opportunities are available for everyone, and the best way to do that is to pay people to do the work. So we do prefer paid internships, but we have worked with some classes. So that's one great way to get involved. You probably have something like that at your university, and we are happy to provide a little snippet, or you provide the snippet and you ask us, is this something you're interested in working with on a student? And we could say yes, or we could say, push it over that way and do it a little bit differently. We'd totally be interested.
That's awesome. And I think one thing you mentioned was the comment periods, Donna, and that's something that we've had registries ask us to do is like notify higher ed whenever there's a comment period. And it's something I would love to be able to do, but I'm like, I have a hard time keeping track of all the open comment periods. So it's something that's on our mind. It's like, how do we make that connection a little bit easier for everybody? But yeah, it sounds like it sounds like there's a lot of evolution that's afoot here. It's just really exciting to be able to have this conversation with you guys today and hear from you. It looks like Sarah has put a project she's working with a research team at Penn State, and she wants you to be aware of it. So Donna, Deborah, make sure you click on that link before we close. And yeah, just taking the last couple of minutes to just really appreciate you both and thank you for the work that Calyx is doing. Yeah, and we appreciate your time.
Can I close with one last thought?
Totally.
When I was still teaching, I often took the chance to teach what I wanted to learn about. So if you feel like this is super interesting, but I know nothing about the voluntary carbon market or greenhouse gas accounting or methodology, so teach a seminar, teach a class, because guess what? You'll learn it and your students will learn it with you. You might even start looking at comment periods. I mean, anyway, that's how I would often learn about what I wanted to learn by just teaching it. So they don't know that you don't know. So you can just be ahead of them and you can learn a ton. So that's my suggestion.
I think that says a little something about your work style, Deborah. Just dive right in. All right. Well, we are 1 minute from time. Donna, did you have any closing thoughts?
No, only just to encourage folks to get involved. Like I said, I feel like this independence that you have as academia is really important for when it comes to integrity. So please get involved. If you're not sure how, feel free to contact us. I see somebody asking for contact information. Maybe Meredith, you can share that out to your constituency.
Sure. And it looks like Deborah put her email in the chat too. Very, very good. Thank you both so much. And I hope everyone has a great rest of your day today.
Great.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
Bye-bye.